Welcome everyone to the session 2.2, Research Data Management for Humanists and Social Scientists. And we are welcome here today by Shahira Khair. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. You're probably going to have to correct me.
That's okay. It's Shahira Khair, but thanks, Megan.
Khair, okay. I will remember not to butcher that in the future. Shahira is a librarian at the University of Victoria Libraries with portfolios in research data curation and organizational analysis. She holds a Master of Science in Biology and a Master of Information, both from University of Ottawa. We also were joined by Matt Huculak.
Pronounced Smith.
Mick?
Smith. No, I'm teasing. You got the two most difficult names at UVic libraries today.
I was a little nervous for it and I didn't practice, so okay. Yeah, Matt is the head of Advanced Research Services at the University of Victoria Libraries with responsibilities in digital scholarship, faculty engagement, and grant work. So my name is Megan Landry, and I am the Humanities and Social Scientists Research Specialist with AceNet organization in the Atlantic provinces, and I am based out of New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. So I am working and streaming today in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I acknowledge this land not only in thanks to the Indigenous communities who have held relationship with this land for generations, but also in recognition of the historical and ongoing legacy of colonialism. So just some brief housekeeping today. So if you are not already signed into Slack for the series, I strongly recommend you do so. I'm going to put a link here in the chat. So we are continuing a lot of the conversation and questions within chat and Slack. And we are asking people that if they have any questions during the presentation itself, that they put them in Slack, just so that the Zoom chat doesn't get overwhelmed, because we have a high amount of users today. But one of us will, I will try to answer your questions, or if it's a really good question, we'll probably save it to the end to ask Matt or Shahira. So each session has its own Slack channel. So there's one specifically for the research data management today. You can also introduce yourself, see any announcements, ask questions to our experts at the Alliance and Federation. And yeah, we ask that you remain muted until you are asked, unless you are asking a question. And this session will be recorded, which has already started. So now I am going to pass it over to Shahira and Matt.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for all of your efforts in organizing this series with our other Alliance HSS colleagues. It's been great working with you. Shahira and I would first like to acknowledge that we are both on the traditional territories of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, which include the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ-speaking, or WSÁNEĆ peoples. The library itself is on a former camas field, and camas is an important flower for the Algonquin-speaking people. And this area provided an opportunity for communities to gather and trade in these camas fields. So the camas fields were nourishing both in terms of actual nutrition, you can eat the bulb of the plant itself, but also as a place of sharing information. And so we hope today's presentation is in that spirit of coming together as a community, different communities, and sharing important information that will benefit us all. So Shahira and I would like to thank the people who've allowed us to live and be here. We'd also like to welcome all of you to this RDM for Humanist workshop. And spoiler alert, RDM stands for Research Data Management. And we're defining this term today as the processes applied through the life cycle of a research project to guide the collection, documentation, storage, sharing, and preservation of research data, right? And this is the SSHRC definition. Why is this session useful? And why are you here today? Well, I hope there's many reasons for that. But this is useful because this is now a Tri-Council requirement. And if you're joining us from outside of Canada, the Tri-Council are the funding agencies that tend to fund a lot of the research work that happens here in Canada. So each one of you in the future may be asked to produce a research data management plan. So we put this workshop together to help you think through what that means for humanists and social scientists. And at the end of this I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let me go to the next slide. I also want to thank Lydia and Sarah, who are teaching the French version of this workshop. I want to acknowledge their labor on top of the labor of the HSS team. Today, our learning outcomes is that we're going to be able to differentiate data formats in HSS research areas. We're also going to identify data in your own research projects, and we're going to express some of your data needs throughout that data lifecycle. And don't worry, we're going to define all of these terms as we go on. And today's hands-on activities are we're going to create a data inventory of your already existing research data. So don't worry, you don't need to bring anything. We're going to be using what you've already done in your career. And we're going to map out the personal data lifecycle of that already existing data. And I'm going to hand it over to Shahira.
Thanks, Matt. So a lot of the content that we're going to be presenting today originates from a SSHRC Connections grant workshop that we held a few years ago at the Digital Humanities Summer Institute. It was a full-day workshop. It was online during the COVID times, but that means that all of that content from that workshop is archived on our Open Science Framework website. And so what we've done for the workshop today is kind of pull out little nuggets of wisdom from all of the different presentations that kind of talk about what research data and data management mean in the humanities. So if you're interested in what we're talking about today, I really encourage you to check out the website. We have really great talks from Humanists in Canada, as well as an excellent keynote from Miriam Posner from UCLA that really addresses this question head on about what data means in the humanities. So there's some really insightful talks. I'll throw the link in the Slack channel.
I also created a short link for us, Shahira.
Oh, so wow.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. You could also use the short link. I'll put both in the chat and in the Slack room. And yeah, whenever you have some free time, I encourage you to check out the website. Let me just do that quickly. Cool. Next slide, Matt. All right, so I like to start pretty much all of my presentations about research data management by just defining so that we're all on the same page what we actually mean by research data. And it really varies across disciplines, but also within disciplines, especially in a field that's so diverse as the humanities is. So the definition that is peddled around most frequently, if you click the next slide, Matt, is the tri-agency definition, which is quite broad. Basically, that research data are any data that are used as primary sources in your scholarship to support that scholarship, research, creative practice, and that are used as evidence in the research process or are commonly accepted in your research community to validate any of your results or conclusions. And so that is quite a broad, generic, all-encompassing definition that often leaves researchers scratching their heads. Next slide, Matt. Particularly in the humanities, this notion of data doesn't often resonate with scholars. Certainly not those authors at the LA Review of Books. But that's also been documented in research communities as well. So if you go to the next slide. So there was a really interesting survey done at the University of Minnesota, and they surveyed, different research disciplines on their campus, asking, what what data they worked with, what data meant to them in their disciplines. And perhaps unsurprisingly, depending on your viewpoint, not all researchers really identified that with the term data to describe the sorts of materials that they work with. And maybe this bar chart is way too small for you, but this is the data that we pulled out for different fields in the humanities and social sciences. And even within, HSS is not a monolith. Different fields have very different, views. The psychologists in the orange, bar chart are pretty comfortable with the term data describing their research materials. Those in English and other linguistic areas were very uncomfortable, much preferring the term research materials. So maybe let's just pause here and open it up to the floor. Is data a uncomfortable word in your discipline? Feel free to either put a response in the chat or unmute yourself. We could make this a little more interactive.
Or is it a dirty word, like in my tradition of English literature?
Hi, I'm Jeannie, and I work in health and social science research, but under the nursing faculty. So we definitely refer to it as data, whether it's qualitative interview data or quantitative, which we're doing increasingly more of that. So no matter how soft or qualitative, we always call it data. And when I started working here over 20 years ago, I was saying data.
Ooh.
And I just remember this, like, funny how no one says that. I changed really quickly.
Don't quote me on this.
It's a funny little side.
Don't quote me on this because I'm a librarian and I need to cite my sources, but I did read an article saying that Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, is responsible for this vowel shift in North America because they had a rule in reading Star Trek scripts that whoever pronounced the word first, that's what they were going to go with. And that's what he did. So we can thank Jean-Luc for that shift.
Well, I always kind of wondered, but I do remember thinking, man, I'm a real newbie. I was like stay-at-home mom back then, came to work, and I was using data and hearing very quickly that, I better change. But anyhow, so yeah, we call it data here.
Thank you, Jeannie. There's some great comments in the chat. So classicists and French literature not comfortable with, or not, I'll say it's unusual with the term data. Linguists, psychologists, very comfortable. In social history, sometimes it's referred as primary source documents. Very interesting. All right. Yeah, so perhaps one reason why data may be considered a bad word is because the sorts of materials that researchers are working with, they may not perceive them as data. And this really surfaced in a survey we did, a few years ago now, where we asked researchers around our campus, what sort of data are they working with? And no one actually called what they were working with data. They were very specific about the sorts of materials that they work with in their research. So, in the humanities, it was everything from, a manila folder in their filing cabinet, and meanwhile, their colleague next door was creating websites and working with XML and working with lots of digital materials. In the fine arts, there was a really wide array of materials that folks considered to be their data, photographs, there's videos, but also, other physical materials like playbills or t-shirts from concerts. And then even within that department, less tangible ideas of what data were, covering things like rumors and gossip and songs. And then in the social sciences, perhaps more traditional views of what data they work with, working with tabular data. But then there were also interesting comments about like not what data are, but what they're used for. So information used in evidence-based decision-making. So a huge range of ideas. And then lastly, in the survey that we ran before our summer workshop, we just asked folks, what sorts of materials they work with. And again, you can see this huge array of formats that data can take in in the humanities and social sciences. And perhaps that's one reason why there's this sort of lack of consensus about what data are in HSS. So perhaps, since there's no kind of agreeable definition of like quote unquote humanities data, our keynote speaker at the summer event, Miriam Posner, suggested perhaps it's not a question of what data are, but a question of like when things become data. So data-ness is not necessarily an inherent quality of whatever research material you're working with, but instead about how a scholar intends to use them. So at what point in the research process do the materials that are being consulted or being worked with, but when do they actually become data versus something else? And I think if that's the case, then what we would like to suggest today is that data are best thought of something that's being produced, either by observation, through the practice of collection, or resulting from analysis, for example. And what does that mean for the research materials that are data? First, that means that data are being considered collectively, so they derive meaning in plural sets. And then how those data or that data set is organized influences what we can learn from that data. So therefore, data sets require purposeful design. And then data and data sets then allow researchers to do things. They're able to be put to work for either reference, analysis, calculation, or whatever you're doing in your research practice. So a really interesting example of this sort of production is given by John Bath from the University of Saskatchewan in his talk, again at that summer event, about research data in the arts. So in the fine arts and in other areas of the humanities, it can be particularly difficult to distinguish research data from artistic outputs. So take, for example, the production of the painting Frida Kahlo's Studio by Damien Elways, who was clearly inspired by the photograph of Frida Kahlo in her studio by Fritz Henley. So perhaps the artist had, a reference photograph, which then, became a sketch, and then an early draft. Maybe then the finished work would be considered data. And from that finished work, you could have many derivatives, prints and other, outputs. So in that scenario, we can ask what's the data versus the output? Was it the original photo? Was it the reference photo? But rather than focusing on that distinction, John Bath instead emphasizes that in the arts, documenting that research process itself is in fact the data. And commercial artists have embraced documenting that research process and making it available to the public, very well, like usually through social media, through like platforms like Instagram. Because the public, want to see how your art is made, but it's also inspirational to other artists and other researchers as well. And it's that process, that documentation of the process that can then serve as data, as that source of inspiration that other research can be built upon or other outputs can be built upon. And he also suggests in that talk, can researchers in the arts learn from this practice of documenting their research and their work, but rather than using privately held software like Instagram, use different research data management tools like exhibit platforms and institutional repositories that libraries provide.
Well, if you thought you were going to have a presentation without Kat today, I'm sorry to disappoint you. The other thing about data, and not just that distinction between the process and the objects collected, is that data itself also plays many different roles depending on how it's being put to use. So for example, here we have a thing, in this case, a picture of a thing, and it has many states, a lot like water. So we can think about data as having three primary states as well. There's the primary object, the description of the object, and then what I personally find to be the hardest part, the documentation around how you've interpreted your data. So I don't know if you remember about a decade ago, when editors started producing editorial statements about the editorial standards they were using in how they created edited collections. It's that type of documentation that I think we're talking about here, is that you're commenting on the process that led you to the conclusions that you've made or the production that you've made through your scholarship. So there's the data about the data, and then that documentation. And all of these are important for analyses at the end of the day. Here we're using a dictionary of the Kalispel language. And in this case, the language itself is the primary source of data. Metadata may exist about it, like a file card indicating important information about the who, what, when, where it was created. And you may also have related field notes, documentation about that source. So all of these can be your research data depending on how you're putting them to use. However, and this is one of our key terms of today, which we're going to come back to, is that these data can also exist in many different formats. Again, with different purposes depending on how they're put to use. So how many of you remember using WordStar? I still have colleagues who are WordStar holdouts. That WordStar document it's a choice, but it's also a format. And format is not only important for usability, it's also important, and this is why the librarians and archivists are coming in here, for longevity. So think about the consequence of writing field notes on high acid paper, for example. These notes will disintegrate over time, and the same is true of the digital realm. So if you want to consider using standards like DocX now, if you have a favorite app on your iPad that you use for taking notes, we're not saying don't use your favorite app. That's perfectly acceptable. It's just start thinking about, can you export those notes to an open format? And if not, what will happen to your research and to those data? Pardon me. One of the big issues with these born digital formats, and for all the librarians and archivists here, I'm sorry to traumatize you right now, but the reason why born digital is so difficult for preservation is, unlike that book object that we can store for 1,000 years if it's printed on non-acid paper, to open up a digital file, you need three things. You need the file itself, you need the software to run that file, and then you need the computer that can run the software to open that file. So these are the type of practical considerations that you need to take into account when you're thinking about your research data management. These considerations of data format influence, again, accessibility, usability, and longevity. And Constance Crompton talks about this again at that original workshop in the Lesbian and Gay Liberation Project in Canada. And Constance's talk is wonderful because I think it really captures the tensions humanists in particular experience in terms of innovation versus preservation. And for Constance, it's all about how do you balance sustainability, particularly in digital humanities projects, so that the materials can be preserved, but still doing innovative research to move the field forward. And this isn't an easy question, and this is a challenge and tension that will continue to exist in the field, and we can't ignore that tension. So for Constance, she has her text corpus of events, dates, people, places, things, which were digitized and then translated into TEI XML. And that format allowed her to build a database, which then allowed her to do analyses, visualizations, and digital exhibits. So she had that multi-step process figured out in order to achieve what she wanted to achieve with that research. And when we're talking about digital representation, we also have to consider all the different formats and the different file types, which are important to keep track of in your own research. So in the presentation on the Spoken Web project by Felicity Taylor, the researchers thought through about the type of formats of the data they were going to produce. And we encourage, and we will be doing, many case studies on your work and ask what your data outputs should be. So for sounding literature, they chose the WAV, the WAV file for their masters. This is a huge file, right, that you wouldn't necessarily serve up on the web. But for that process of serving up on the web, they chose MP3 as the access copy. So again, the same item, the same recording of an individual might exist in different formats depending on the goal you're trying to achieve, the goal of preservation versus the goal of access, right? And in case anyone is feeling uncomfortable at this point of talking about data as reducing their work to these fine points, we do recognize, of course, the materials we're talking about are more than just data, and they're more than just the sum of their parts. So for instance, in Indigenous language, data isn't just data. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples reminds us that language is one of the main instruments for transmitting culture from one generation to another, and for communicating meaning and making sense of the collective experience. And as Eva Chakowska described in her talk on Indigenous data language documentation, the products of language documentation and other humanities projects can and broadly are referred to as data. And it's helpful to do so for the reasons covered thus far. So also thinking about separating the purpose-driven, i.e. preservation or access, from the cultural significance that it may have. So here we're going to stop talking and we're going to start talking about data inventories. And here on the left, well, my left, your screen, we have a sample chart of what a data inventory is according to a project. And what you see here is a little path that helps you think through this three-step process that we're talking about: your action, the material, and format at the end. So Shahira is going to run you through her favorite author, Tolkien, and environmentalism to sort of give you an idea of what this looks like in practice. You're on mute.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I'm a big Tolkien nerd here. Yeah, so you can just, as an example, you can imagine, you're doing research on this topic of Tolkien and environmentalism. So perhaps, the first process of your project is to analyze his scholarship, and maybe that involves materials that like correspondence between him and other researchers, and also analyzing, perhaps his lectures at Oxford. Okay, so you have your process, you have your two types of materials. Each of those materials are represented by different, formats and file types in a digital environment. So perhaps those letters are, TIFF files. Perhaps they're actual physical letters too. This doesn't always have to be digital either. The lectures, maybe they're audio, and those are MP3 files. You might also be in your second process, analyzing published texts. And so your materials would be like the manuscripts of his novels, for example. And those would be represented by either the physical text or a digital representation, say a PDF. Those would be your primary source material. And then on top of that, you might also be creating other types of data, say spreadsheets, tracking attributes or taking images of those materials or notes. All of those are your secondary data, again, which can be represented by different formats and file types in a digital environment. So what we'd like to do is take maybe 15 minutes and just have everyone kind of reflect on what we've presented so far, but put that into practice, documenting data in one of your own research projects, maybe something you're working on currently or a project you've been involved in the past that you saw through to completion. I'll put a link to a Google Jamboard that we've created for this purpose. Hopefully some of you have used Google Jamboard before. It's very simple. It's just a bunch of sticky notes. And you can create a copy of the Jamboard that we've created by clicking those three dots in the top right corner. And then we're not writing over each other's Jamboards.
Or we can write over one
Sure.
another too. And please feel free to unmute at
Yeah.
this point so we can also chit chat as we work through this process. And I'm currently going through an evaluation process with my team here at UVic Libraries. So as you start thinking through your work, I'll just think through my work right now in terms of my need to preserve some of the documentation that I'm creating right now. Shahira, are you cool with this?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, and like Matt said, feel free to unmute yourselves, as if you're encountering an issue or question about your own data, and we can talk through it together.
So I have a question actually. For the process, if I'm in literature, is the process then consulting works like in an archive or in a library, or is it the actual reading of the primary source document? I'm just not sure what the process is there.
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe can you give a little bit more context about the sort of project that you're working on?
Yeah, so I'm a 17th century French literary scholar, and I'm studying the representation of women as the vengeful sex in early 17th century tragedies. And so I've been looking at, I spent 3 months in France in the spring, in the archives and the research libraries, reading texts that haven't yet been digitized, but also requesting digitization of certain documents as needed. And also taking pictures at some of the texts when I was in municipal libraries. So I'm reading and then eventually doing close reading analysis of these texts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be. I think you'll end up with a lot of different materials for that one process. So it really depends on, I guess, if there are kind of like ways to break apart that process. Are there different kind of like questions or like sorts of materials that can be grouped together that might be helpful?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so I would have like the tragedies that I study, but then also like books of conduct and moral treatises and things like that.
Yeah, I think
So
it's helpful to break those or to categorize those sorts of processes, which can be a challenge, which we'll talk about once we've spent some time doing the exercise.
Sure.
But thank you.
And Heather, that's a great question in terms of also sort of your theoretical paradigm of approaching these items as well, right? Because there's that two-part process of the research project. You have that proximal intention, right? I think I may find things like this at these libraries, and we won't get into formats right now because I'm sure you have a ton of formats. So for example, if you took images of something at the French library on your iPhone, chances are, if you haven't changed the settings in your camera, it's a specific iPhone format called HEIC, right? And that's important because Apple can be tricky sometimes when it comes to long-term access. So you'll want to export those to JPEGs. But to go back to your process, are you bringing perhaps a gender-informed reading to your research, which might influence how and what you're looking for? So this is also an opportunity there to think about sort of what your intellectual heritage is as you're involved in this research process. So for example, I tend to be informed a lot by Pierre Bourdieu. If you look at my dissertation, Bourdieu is everywhere. That might be something I indicate as part of my process, that this sociological examination of these things is important because X, Y, Z, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. So that would be a separate process because it's the theoretical framework that you're applying. Is that?
Yes, and this is where things get really tricky and why there's going to always be a tension in the humanities with data is, where do you draw that line in terms of, we are unique individuals who are bringing ourselves and our experiences to this research project, which might naturally form specific patterns that are unique to us and how we see the world based on how we've become who we are. I don't want to get too esoteric there, but it's sort of that self-reflection of that you would do in that documentation.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Joyce, did you want to go next? You had a question?
Sure. Yeah, I'm looking at this process and I'm thinking, am I documenting what I expect to be outputs of the project, or am I documenting process when it becomes like a roadmap to where I'm going?
I think for this exercise, focus on process. We get more to
Okay.
output in the second exercise. So you are thinking ahead, which is great.
Okay, so so in my case, I'm looking at a project working on a family archive, which includes manuscript diaries and photographs and realia. And so would I break up the processes? For example, with a manuscript diary, there's scanning, there's producing an OCR, there's marking up the text. Those would be different processes in my mind, or is that all one stream and then dealing with photographs would be another?
I mean, I think the way you've described it, that to me sounds like materials, but I might be misunderstanding the process as well. Like I don't know your project, so
Right.
yeah,
Okay. Well, I'll sit with this as we go along and see
sure,
how it
yeah.
shapes up. Yep. That's thanks.
I've got the original slide up. So in this case, you might say analysis of
manuscript.
Or
Right.
analysis of
Yes.
communication.
Got it.
Right?
Yes, of course.
And then
Yep.
under communication, you have correspondence.
Yes.
You have
Or
letters.
diaries. You have letters. Yes. Okay. Perfect.
That's how you might think through
Got
that
it.
particular trail.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm going to copy a great idea from I see in the French session. They've asked participants to take a screenshot of their sticky board and put it in the Slack channel. So if anyone's comfortable doing that once you're done, it'd be helpful to see where we've gotten to.
Yeah, I think for me, this first step here, that meta step, is sort of the biggie for us, and because this is just so natural to us as part of the research process. And when I say us, I mean my own tradition of humanities, like analysis of scholarship. Well, yes, of course. What else would I be doing? But really breaking that down to analysis of published text, analysis of unpublished text, analysis of what have you. So taking that step back.
And it can also be helpful to think about what sorts of questions you're trying to answer. Like those might inform how the processes you take and how it can be divided. Again, obviously this is all very specific to your projects, but that can be another starting point.
Ooh. On the Jamboard, we have extracellular vesicles DNA database.
Thanks for sharing your screenshot, Diane. I think how you've broken it up is looks great to me, actually. So it looks to me like for processes, you split them based on different methodology. So the online survey versus the interviews, which I think is a great way to go about it.
How are folks doing? Raise your hand. Great.
One thumbs up.
Feel free to use the other Zoom reactions too, like the green check mark if you're getting along okay, or the red X maybe if you're having some trouble brainstorming and want some assistance.
Should we do 2 more minutes, Shahira?
That's too bad. I see Mike, thanks for putting your screenshot in the Slack channel. Again, yeah, that's a great way to break it up. So analyzing, like grouping the processes by different types of materials. So papyri, like archaeology, and then archival material. And then it's interesting to see them converge, the materials converge into like similar sets of like file formats.
So as folks continue to work or finish up, are there any challenges that you faced? I think for me, one of the first challenges is actually breaking down my process as a humanist into a chart, which seems quite strange because normally I would describe my process as involving stress hormones and caffeine, which isn't particularly helpful for a research data management plan. But actually thinking through, okay, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish in this process? And then how do I explain that? And let's go back to that initial slide, is that if we are submitting these to a grant funding agency, and there may be a group of people on that adjudication committee who may or may not know my field, how do we explain to them what our process is and put it on a chart so it's easily understandable to them as they go through these applications? Did anyone else have any issues that they encountered immediately? And it could be a feeling too.
Not a challenge, but just an insight that I realized that I'm so close to the work I do that I couldn't think, what are the processes? Yes, of course. And as soon as the word analyze popped up and I went, oh yeah, right. Yeah, okay. So there is primary literature, there's archival literature. Yeah, and there's different avenues of investigation that you go through that produce something at the end. Yeah, thank you. This is really super.
Absolutely. And I think that's the perfect way of describing it, Joyce.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like
Thanks.
that term. Thank you.
In fact, we might have to steal that for a
Yeah,
future
absolutely.
presentation, if you don't mind.
Oh, please do, because I've already forgotten what I said. So the curse of ATT. Please write it down for me. Thanks.
All right. Oh, Mike. How to incorporate all the secondary reading. Absolutely.
And this is becoming a larger issue, particularly as we move into different ways of accessing information. Like 20 years ago, journal article, book article, but now with the proliferation of databases, different e-resources being provided by both libraries and humanities or social science scholars themselves, you have much more inputs and outputs to think through.
So some of the, if you want to jump ahead, Matt, some of the challenges that surface in Miriam's talk that I think resonated most with people attending were these. So first, like demarcation. So what constitutes like your data or your data set, setting up those boundaries to like articulate those avenues of investigation, Joyce, can be really challenging. Those sorts of boundaries between like your materials and your work may seem artificial. Categorization is another challenge. You know, particularly where like materials can be very like contextual and like established standards for grouping materials together often don't exist in many humanities fields. Parameterization, so establishing scales for describing relationships between pieces of data can be really challenging for like less tangible concepts. Like obviously like dates are one thing, but there are many kind of less tangible types of data that humanists work with. And then ontological stability. I don't know who Heidegger is, Matt, so I won't be able to make any jokes.
I've been trying all morning, can't do it.
Okay. How we divide up, you know, the world says a lot, or how we divide up our data says a lot about how we see the world. But do our ontologies about how we would want to describe our research materials align with those of our peers working, you know, in similar fields of research? All right. So in the second half of the presentation today, we'd like to jump on to managing your data. So hopefully we're all in agreement that, you know, research materials are data. And if we have data, they need to be managed appropriately throughout their life cycle to ensure that they are, you know, usable, preservable, accessible, all those important things. So what is research data management? Like Matt defined at the start of this presentation, data management is the processes that are being applied throughout the life cycle of a project to guide the production, documentation, storage, sharing, and preservation of that really important resource that underlies all of our scholarship, which is our data. So folks may or may not be familiar with the concept of like the research life cycle. Certainly, I expect most of you have experienced it. So where you start, you know, planning for a project, writing your proposal, you know, getting the, you know, resources together, doing the work, you know, synthesizing it in a publication, and then sharing it outwards. But alongside that research life cycle, is another life cycle that applies to all of those materials that you're working with. So your data, where, you know, planning is involved in terms of how you go about, you know, producing or collecting that data, documenting that data to ensure that you have the necessary metadata or documentation like Matt talked about earlier, making sure that, you know, if it's sensitive data, that it is securely protected and stored in, you know, robust infrastructure, you know, deciding what of your data to share, and then all of the considerations for preservation that need to be made, especially in a digital environment. And all of that exists for all of these files that you've inventoried on your Jamboards. And so why is thinking about the life cycle of these data, of our data, important? especially at the outset, it can be helpful for identifying, what resources, tools, expertise you need in order to successfully complete your project, to ensure that your data are, usable over time. Taking a life cycle approach can help you identify and therefore solve problems before they occur. So, maybe you don't realize that you need to have, a certain type of storage. Maybe you're working with really large files and you hadn't thought about that, ahead of time. That can really delay your project, for example. Staying organized throughout your project, like Matt mentioned, digital projects today are working with many more types of data and many more larger volumes of data, and that means that it's more challenging to stay organized. So the life cycle approach can help with that. Ensuring that data privacy is respected is another important consideration depending on the types of materials you work with. It also helps support collaboration and sharing. If your data at the end of your project is not well documented, it's not organized, it's not easy to work with a collaborator or to share it with someone else in a way that they're able to independently work with it. And then, of course, respecting, granting agency and publisher requirements around, transparency, planning, and sharing your data, which are more and more common now. Yeah. So how do you actually go about thinking about the life cycle? I think it's, I think we all kind of understand it in theory, but when it comes to actually applying that sort of view to our work, it can be quite challenging, especially if you're working with really complicated projects. So when I meet with researchers, the first thing I often do is ask them to kind of model their workflow. And here's just a really basic example. Hopefully you're able to read the text. It's not too small, but this is a basic workflow for a systematic review. So for that review, your data would include the literature that you find, the data that you extract from it, and all of the methods and information about that process that someone else needs in order to reproduce your work. So to model that workflow and the data that's going to be produced throughout it, you can start thinking about the different stages of that workflow and especially how they are sequenced relative to one another. So for example, in this workflow, for your review, first you're going to define your research question. Maybe just jump back, Matt, so it's not one more actually. Yeah, so you start by defining your research question. Then you'll do an initial scan of the literature. You'll come up with your review protocol. Then you'll actually execute your search. Then you'll be screening the articles you find, extracting data from it, analyzing that data, and then synthesizing it in an article. At each and every one of those stages, next slide, you're going to be producing data. So again, going back to our inventory of all these different data formats and file types, each of those should be associated with a different point of your workflow. At what point are they being produced? And so pairing up your data with your workflow can be really helpful for asking important questions about how those files need to be managed throughout the workflow. Next slide. Yeah, so you can, with it visualized like this, you can ask, where do these files need to be stored? What security features are needed for them? What project members are involved at different points of this workflow? Will they have access, to that infrastructure? What software do I need in order to, read or analyze these files? What are the relationships between them? And then how long do each of these files persist throughout the project? Are they an intermediary file? Are they a final output? Visualizing it like this can be really helpful. And I'm going to turn over to Matt to walk you through a real life example of those considerations being put into practice. Oh, you're muted, Matt.
2.5 years into a Zoom environment, and I still get absolutely going to be talking about the transgender archives here at the University of Victoria. It's the largest collection of documents relating to the history of the activists, community leaders, and researchers who have contributed to the betterment of trans, non-binary, and two-spirited people. And their research materials are varied, and they wanted a way to develop a means to surface this material to the community when appropriate, right? So the type of data that they have in the archives include books, periodicals, pamphlets, clippings, erotic fiction, organizational records, personal papers and correspondence. If there's any archivists in the room right now, I think you're probably recognize a lot of this. Research records, court case recordings, movies and video recordings, photographs, original artworks, etc. So again, we've just sort of listed everything that you might find, for example, in a finding aid. What they wanted to build out of all of this was an online database that the community could interact with. So they went through the collections, they chose 93 publications, 939 issues that included over 6,500 articles and 1,000 events to create this online discovery tool. And so they had to map out how to get from the collection, sort of those physical archives and some digital, to the web search online interface. So how did they get there? So in 2016, their team identified a representative selection of their periodical titles, and then began a multi-year project of reviewing each page and tracking historically valuable details. There's a term that I find very interesting, because what's historically valuable today might be different 10 years from now. So again, that indicates right there why that documentation is so important of how was this historically valuable, such as people, places, dates, titles, subject, keyword. And the database represents approximately 20% of the total collection. So mapping out the life cycle of the data being generated was important to ensure that there was high quality data and that the platform would actually work and be useful at the time that it was finished being built. So what type of people did they need on the team? People who knew the primary source material. So the head archivist, the chair in transgender studies, Aaron DeVore, someone to come up with the metadata standard. So the library's head of metadata in this particular case, people who could actually do the data extraction, a wonderful team of interns that are associated with the project, someone who can clean the data and make it work with the platform for sharing. Spoiler alert, this was Shahira. And then someone to manage the project and coordinate with everyone. And the archive has Michael Rodmacher, who is the project manager that sort of went through this process and guided it through all these different stages. So at the beginning, they had to ask, what type of tools are they going to need based on the data requirements, but also the project requirements. So the project requirement here is we want our collection surfaced so that the community can interact with it. That's a broad project requirement. But the data, it was just text, so it wasn't extremely large. We're not talking gigabytes of video, but it still needed a schema and tools to ensure that the data being collected by so many people was standardized. And it's that type of standardization that's particularly important here, which is why the metadata librarian was key. They needed the tools to be free and easily accessible. Privacy wasn't a concern for the data they were collecting, so they had to go through that process. How much of this material might affect the lives of the people being represented within the periodicals. And then they ended up choosing a Google form, built their schema in it, and it was stored on the cloud in Google so they could have group access. And that is a huge issue for many projects. Even just simple, when I say simple, access rules can be quite a challenge. So the end product of all of this work was a dashboard in Tableau, which is a free tool that provides shareable data. They needed the workflow to curate Google Sheets in a format that worked with Tableau. So once they analyzed the requirements, they realized Tableau would be a system that worked for them, and then they could present it on the web. And they were sure that the file type and format and the structure data would also work upstream. So if the tool changed or if something else needed to happen, if they wanted to provide geographical coordinates, for example, what other tool might we use? So, and then again, here's another real life example that I'm going to pass over to Shahira.
Thanks, Matt. So hopefully that illustrates kind of the power of thinking through, what sorts of resources and infrastructure you need for your data that come up from that lifecycle or workflow approach. Here's another real life example of a really detailed data workflow that Felicity Taylor presented in her talk on the spoken word project. And so in this sort of mapping, you can see really clearly what data is being created and transformed at each stage of the project, from data collection to processing to sharing and preservation. And not all of the data that's being produced at each of those phases makes it through to the next phase. Sometimes it's synthesized, sometimes it's a transitory file. But plotting out your data in these phases can really help you identify different management considerations. So if you click next, Matt. Yeah, you can see, different types of files need to be stored on different infrastructure for different purposes. So, the files that, required a lot of data processing are being stored on Compute Canada infrastructure. The files that are being shared are being stored on another piece of infrastructure that provides that function. You can also ask other important questions, especially around, sensitive data, what sort of ethics, what data require ethics approval before being collected, or in this case, also around copyright, what sorts of files require, like different licensing considerations, and to go through that process too. Because of course, we're working with many different types of files. Each of them have different management considerations associated with them. And so especially like in large group projects or in projects involving sensitive information, it's really important to pay attention to data security and access. So all of the files that you've mapped out in your inventory exist along this spectrum. So, perhaps they're, sensitive materials that are meant for, internal access only, so closed access, to, files that are able to be fully openly shared and anyone can access them, or somewhere in between. Maybe there's, mediated group access. It's important to identify early on where your files fall along the spectrum so you can determine and implement solutions to ensure that, certain members have access to files that they need to, or don't have access to files that are more restricted, and ensure that you have the infrastructure and support to support that security and appropriate access. When it comes to the far right side of that spectrum around data sharing, a lot of researchers, struggle with what of their data they should be sharing. Not all of the data that you collect in a research project needs to be shared. And so one kind of guiding question I often ask them is, what furthers the needs of your research community? What's going to further research in your field? Sometimes it's the raw input data that others can reuse for analysis. Other times it's actually the interpreted data that's been kind of curated or processed, or in this analogy, like the cooked data. You can also think about, what tools are available to you for sharing that data. So in the example that Matt went through of the transgender archives, they could have just chosen to share, their spreadsheets of their data. But they felt that some way of, visually representing and allowing facilitating search was needed for their actual goal of sharing, which was better discoverability and access. So that's another important consideration.
And just one more consideration before we go into the final activity for today is a project that's dear to me, and that's the Endings project, and that has to do with preservation. So I've been involved in a few digital humanities projects. I have colleagues who are involved in many digital humanities projects, and one thing we realized is just how fragile everything we had created actually was. So we applied for a grant and did a huge study of DH projects around the world, and it turns out most projects don't have a preservation plan. 25% of DH projects disappear within 5 years. It's a huge problem. So we came up with a set of principles to help people think through how to preserve their data that mirrors a lot what we're about to have you do. And that's thinking about what are you producing, documenting it, processing products, and then release management. A particular concern for humanists, particularly in DH, is when is your project done, right? In traditional scholarship, you finish the article, you finish your book, boom, done, moving on to the next thing. DH projects don't necessarily act that way. It could be a multi-year project. So the Endings principles help you think through what you're doing and then how to address some of these bigger concerns. So please feel free to use those principles. And then, gave away Michael Scott. We're going to do our workflow exercise. So time to organize your file inventory into a workflow.
Yeah, so we thought for the next, let's take 5 minutes, and then that'll give us 10 minutes left for questions. Yeah, just spend time back in your inventory, trying to think through how those files are being created over the life cycle. Maybe you want to, take another copy of your inventory and do it on a separate sheet, but try to organize them to fall under different stages of your project. And if you have any questions, feel free to unmute and ask them. Do you want to go back to slide 34, Matt, just as like a visual reference? Yeah. So maybe try to approximate something like this, where you have kind of discrete stages of your project and then different files being associated with them.
So Shahira, not to pick on, was it Joyce or Allison who's working in France? What might that look like in this process? If I'm going to would I do this for each library I'm visiting? Like, what would that look like for modeling a workflow in that specific project?
I mean, I think I would try to keep it simple, and I think it was Heather, but I might be wrong too. Like if it's like consulting or screening different materials in those archives, that could be one stage of data collection. Yeah.
It was Heather.
Okay, yeah, I remembered right. And then listing all of the different formats or data formats and files that are being created in that stage. And it's up to you how discrete or general you want to be in your workflow. If you have a really good understanding of your workflow, it's easy to be very specific. But if you're getting started in a project, you may not know all those phases yet, especially if you're relatively new to research.
Or even just documenting the research process.
For sure.
And this does get easier the more you do it. And Shahira, if you're someone like me and at the screening of articles phase, I feel like you're a much better person than I am, because you probably do create a screening worksheet where I just have a folder in which I dump everything. Would I indicate just folder structure here if that is my personal workflow?
I mean, yeah, potentially, but like, do you have that structure documented somewhere? Like, I know what you're saying. Like, if you're working in, say, like a Zotero library, presumably you're organizing how those files are like organized, right? Like with your file structure. Maybe there's like files that you want to include or exclude, or like are organized according to different attributes. So documenting at the very least that organization would be helpful.
I'm glad you used the word attributes, because that was I also use tags a lot in Zotero. So including my tags, could we consider that an attribute?
Sure, all of that is useful metadata that you're generating in your project and should be included in the workflow.
Okay.
All right, maybe since we only have less than 10 minutes left, is that right, Megan? Okay. Feel free to continue working in your Jamboards, obviously. But I guess at this point we want to say surprise. This work is really helpful if any of you want to start writing a data management plan, which is actually the next session today, so very good timing. That's really, from my experience, helping researchers, write proper DMPs. This sort of work that you're doing right now about inventorying your data and describing your workflow is kind of the foundation of any sort of data management plan. So once you've got this down, DMPs are super easy, or easy to write, not necessarily easy to solve any sort of problem.